welcome. There are moments in life when we become aware of where we stand in relation to others. This feeling can happen quietly and almost without notice. A passing thought, a comparison, a sense that someone else is further ahead, more accomplished, or somehow closer to where we feel we should be. In those moments, the mind begins to measure. It looks outward, gathers information, and then turns inward, drawing conclusions that can feel surprisingly heavy. Comparison is not always obvious. Sometimes it appears as motivation, sometimes as reflection, and sometimes as a subtle dissatisfaction that is difficult to fully explain. You may find yourself thinking, as indeed I often do myself, about where you are in life, how far you have come, and how that seems to relate to the paths of others. And in doing so, something shifts. What was once simply your own experience becomes something that is being evaluated. In Buddhist thought, this tendency to compare is not seen as unusual. It is part of how the mind seeks orientation, trying to understand itself through contrast. Yet within that process, there are certain patterns that can slowly lead to a sense of unease. This comparison itself is not inherently wrong, but it can quickly become tied to identity, worth, and expectation. One reflection that can be helpful is the recognition that comparison often feeds a sense of craving. When the mind focuses on what others have, or where others appear to be, it can create a feeling that something is missing. A different life, a different outcome, a different version of oneself begins to take shape in the imagination. Have you ever noticed how quickly the mind can move from simply observing someone else's situation to feeling that you should be there as well? In this way, comparison can turn into a quiet form of wanting, where the present moment begins to feel insufficient. Another idea within Buddhism is that each person's path is shaped by a unique set of conditions. Experiences, opportunities, challenges, and timing all vary in ways that are often not fully visible. When comparison takes place, it tends to focus on outcomes, on what can be seen externally, while overlooking the many factors that have contributed to that position. What happens when two lives are placed side by side, even though the circumstances that shape them are entirely different? There can be a sense of imbalance in that comparison, as though something is being measured without a full understanding of what is actually being compared. There is also the recognition that status and position are not fixed. In the same way that thoughts and emotions change, so too do circumstances. What appears stable at one moment may shift in ways that were not anticipated. Success can change, roles can evolve, and the things that once seemed important may lose their significance over time. When the mind attaches to where someone is now, it can overlook the fact that everything is in motion. Have you ever looked back and realized how much has changed, even within your own life, over a relatively short period of time? Another aspect of comparison involves the way the mind relates to external validation. Praise, recognition, and approval can feel meaningful, and at times, they can bring a sense of reassurance. Yet these forms of validation are not always consistent. They depend on many factors, including the perspectives and expectations of others. When the mind begins to rely on these external signals as a measure of worth, it can become sensitive to fluctuation. A moment of recognition may feel uplifting, while its absence may feel like something is lacking. In this way, comparison can become tied to a cycle that is difficult to stabilize. Within Buddhist teaching, there is often a gentle invitation to turn attention back toward direct experience, not as a rejection of others, but as a way of reconnecting with what is actually present. The question is not necessarily how one compares, but what is being experienced here and now. There may be moments of effort, moments of rest, moments of uncertainty, and moments of clarity. Each of these arises within its own context, shaped by conditions that are specific to that moment. Contentment, in this sense, is not presented as something that depends on being ahead or behind. It is not something that is granted by comparison. Rather, it begins to emerge when the mind is less occupied with measuring and more able to observe. When the constant movement of comparison softens, even slightly, there can be a sense of space where experience is no longer being filtered through the lens of more or less. This does not mean that comparison disappears entirely. The mind may still notice differences, still observe others, still form impressions. But there can be a shift in how those observations are held. Instead of becoming conclusions about worth or direction, they can remain as simple observations, without the added weight of judgment. Over time, this can lead to a different relationship with one's own path. Rather than something that needs to be constantly evaluated against others, it becomes something that unfolds according to its own conditions. There may still be movement, still be growth, still be change. But it is no longer driven by the same sense of urgency to align with someone else's timeline. And perhaps this is where comparison begins to lose some of its intensity, not because it has been removed, but because it is no longer being held in the same way. The mind no longer needs to draw the same conclusions from it. It no longer needs to turn every observation into a judgment. In Buddhist practice, this shift is not about forcing a new perspective. It is about seeing clearly, seeing how comparison arises, how it influences thought and feeling, and how it can shape the way experience is interpreted. And within that clarity, there can be a gradual softening of the patterns that once felt automatic. So when comparison appears, it may not always be something that needs to be resisted. It can simply be noticed. A movement of the mind, drawing connections, forming impressions, creating meaning. And within that noticing, there can be a quiet recognition that not everything needs to be measured. Each path continues in its own way. Each moment unfolds within its own set of conditions. And within that unfolding, there can still be space for a sense of steadiness, independent of where anyone else appears to be. Thank you for being here, and take care of yourself.